Your SOAR will allow you to create both simple and complex workflows to allow as much automation as you need. The first example that I'm going to walk through here is a relatively simple one where we will gather DomainTools predictive risk scores as the SOAR ingests these new alerts. And along this journey, we're going to take a look at a newly observed domain that was identified in our real-time threat feed last week. There will be a few red arrows pointing out the DomainTools enrichment stages to make it easier to follow along. As you are creating your playbooks or stories, it is important to remember that you may have a series of investigate, enrich, and DNSDB transforms that are ready for you to use when needed. In the case of this story, we're accepting alerts from our SIM that were triggered by activity against newly observed domains. The goal here is to automate a way to quickly triage as many of these alerts before an analyst needs to look into anything. And in case you don't already recognize it, this is a story created within Tines. As we look at the top half of the story, we see the alerts coming in, and then there are a few basic processing actions. You could read this deduplicate action in a couple of different ways. It could ensure that a batch of incoming data is trimmed down to only unique items. Or if your source stores information about enrichment actions that it has recently completed, this could be an action to set those pieces of data aside since we already have enriched data for them. In our example, we should be ingesting a list of only domains, but just in case we have an action to the right-hand side that will take an IP address and use a DNSDB passive DNS enrichment to see what domain names are associated with that IP address. You can see those results here on the left. Then we push them back into the part of the workflow that deals with those domains. As you can see here in our example, we took a single IP address, found all the domains that were observed in passive DNS within the last month. Now we've got a series of domain names that get pushed into that bottom box, and we're going to use an iris enrich call to gather the domain risk score, as well as some registration information about these domains. Progressing now to the bottom half of the story, we've performed our enrichment action to gather data. Based on that risk score, we could now perform multiple different actions. In this case, I have 3 actions based on high, medium, and low risk scores. Once the next decision is made, we progress through the story. In this case, a domain that is a medium risk might trigger the SOAR to send the enriched data into a different story that will gather more information, or perhaps it's going to take the data that it has and send it to an analyst for inspection. The high-risk path performs another series of actions. In the case of that newly observed domain that I had mentioned, it happens to be called 1688overseasa.com. We can see that its risk score is definitely high. In fact, all of its risk profile scores are 95 or above, and that triggers the high-risk path, and the story continues along performing more actions. In this case, we trigger an action to perform a lookup and gather any subdomains that may also have been observed by passive DNS activity. This allows us to gather a set of domains to look at and potentially take action against. Plus, it gives us a time frame showing us when these domains have been active. As you can see here, I've decided that domains discovered in this way should be pushed over to our edge team for a form of blocking action, perhaps on a firewall or a proxy.